What is going on, guys? This is Skyhound, also known as Geek Archivist, Xavier Pierce, and welcome to episode 0 of Otaku Center of this Geek Archivist podcast. I apologize in advance if the name Otaku Center doesn't sound as interesting, but bear with me for a bit. Considering this is episode 0, obviously this means one thing. This is more or less an origin type of episode. With that being said, as the title suggests, what was it that got me into anime? Well, in order for me to turn back the clock, I need to provide some context, especially some historical context, with a bit of mathematics thrown in. Something that Gen Z people unfortunately do not grasp. Why? Because those of us that are Gen Y and Gen X understand things that Gen Z does not. So, with that being said, let us begin. So, to bring it back, long before you had smartphones, long before you had streaming services like Amazon and Netflix, long before you had iTunes and Apple, long before you even had electric cars, we had back in the day the typewriter, overheads, cassette tapes, Walkmans, for those of you guys who know those, as well as antenna TVs, thin floppy disks before we had those slightly thick ones. Those of us in the 90s know about this stuff. We also had VHS tapes and vinyl discs. So, even before those, even before the USB drives, we use those floppy disks to actually store data. When it came to making playlists, before the CDs, you did it on a cassette tape and then you put it in the Walkman. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the precursor to the MP3 players. What else am I throwing in here? Before you could even, watch some of these missed episodes online and the like, you had to rely on TV Guide. And if you missed out on a show that you really liked or a program or whatever on TV, too bad. You lucked out. On top of that, with the antenna TVs, for those of us who are old enough to know this stuff, in order to get a signal, you had to adjust the damn antennas on the top of the damn TV box. And with regards to communication, before you even had message boards and instant messenger and all of that shit, some of us had what is known as the brick phone. Some of you guys are probably going to be laughing. Why is this guy bringing up old tech? Because Gen Y, as well as Gen Z, don't realize how good you have it. You don't. You know why? Because Gen X understands that shit a lot better than you think. Plus, speaking of mathematics, I can tell, and they can tell, you were never born. You weren't. All of this stuff that I'm bringing up right now, you were never born when this happened. Or if you were likely still a baby, which means you wouldn't know this stuff. So don't think that I haven't actually lived a life. It is you guys, Gen Z, that have not lived a life. Gen X and Gen Y have. We know what we're talking about. We have been through this stuff. You have not. But enough of my little retro history rant and bashing of modern times. You guys are probably wondering, what anime do I recall from my time? Since I'm turning the clock back, let me start off with one little tidbit about reruns. Remember, early on in my little rant, in order to get a signal on an antenna TV, you have to adjust it. And with regards to reruns, those things were a thing back then. However, regarding the category of anime, while it does refer to Japanese animation, in order to get a better understanding of what started it, you're going to have to look into some documentaries. Particularly, one of the things that Japan caught wind of was Disney animation. Yeah, you heard me. Walt Disney Animation back in the day, before it became the shit that it is now. Japan took that, ran with it, and made their own thing. Funny thing is, during the 60s, even though I know I wasn't born during that time, some of you either have seen the live action of this or you don't know it at all. But here's a clue: Mach 5, racing, and evil organizations trying to one up this main character. And he also has a support team. Ladies and gentlemen, this is from the 60s. Now, if you noticed, for that brief few seconds, the style of this art form, the name of this anime is Speed Racer. However, this wasn't the only old anime that I remember as a kid. For some of you guys, you were likely into mechs, or mechas as it's usually referred to. Easily, off the top of my head, I can start rattling off particular titles. Now, if I'm going to go historically in a certain order here, most would mention about Gundam. However, before that was born, you had ones like Mazinger Z, as well as another one that's referred to as Robotech. Original title, of course, being Macross. Now, the Gundams actually started in the 70s. Mazinger Z was long before that. However, here's something that you don't realize. While some would say Transformers, that, ladies and gentlemen, was back in Japan. Americans just flipped it for their purposes. But you're likely about to mention a particular voice actor, and I know who you're thinking. Because what I'm about to reveal next, you likely only know him as a narrator. However, what if I told you that this team didn't actually have one, but two teams? Yeah, one of them was vehicles. The second are all lions. And this voice actor was actually in both. And you're probably hearing the theme in your head right now. So, if you're thinking about what I think you're thinking, let's see if you know this. Yeah, that is definitely old for sure. Voltron actually has two teams. If you're able to piece together the little clues I mentioned before me playing that clip, at least some of you guys are paying attention. On top of that, in case you're wondering, yes, the soundtrack exists. There's your proof, ladies and gentlemen, because I already own a copy. Also, quick shout out to the composer, John Peterson, who created the iconic soundtrack. Now, while most of you guys are going to be mentioning about not just Gundam, but there are a bunch of other examples I can easily rattle off. Neon Genesis Evangelion being one, The Big O being another. Then we get to some of the more lesser known stuff. One of them is from the early 2000s. But what's interesting about this is that you have types that are actually, how would I put this, multi-genre. While you can also use this with books, the same can also be said for anime. And it's actually more common than you think. So this particular anime in the early 2000s, before the internet started to go haywire, is one that probably a certain number of us know. Because it was addressing the silliness and the stupidity in terms of mentality of men and women in general. Plus, he also had to deal with mechs that have to fight against something that was actually killing off human beings. And both genders were living on separate planets. If that is pretty much clues enough, ladies and gentlemen, I give to you Vandred. Yeah, this anime is one that likely would not have been made today for the most obvious reasons, which I can likely already state. However, there is one that I think isn't addressed as much, and yet, in terms of mechs, again, besides the ones that I mentioned, there is one that I know is beloved in my native homeland of the Philippines. Most Filipinos know this like the back of their hand. And yet, in terms of adaptations, they did a damn good job of respecting the source material. And that title is Voltus 5. While the film itself is recent, the anime isn't, because that was roughly in the 70s and 80s. Now, to fast forward a little bit, I'm going to be shifting gears because there's one particular anime that not only has a bit of Yuri in it, it also happens to have mechs in it. The only reason is it's based on Japanese folklore. Now, for those of you who are actually into that stuff a bit like myself, maybe, just maybe, you're familiar with the story of Ame no Murakumo and Yamata no Orochi. Now, if you have played a game known as Okami, that pretty much is reiterating the exact same story, except a little bit more into Japanese folklore. You actually play a wolf that is in reference to the goddess known as Amaterasu. Again, part of Japanese folklore. So, what is this anime that has mechs and Yuri in it? Well, you either know it or you don't. But kudos to my best friend for introducing me to this. This Destiny of the Shrine Maiden, also known as Kanazuki no Miko. Now, this one actually does have a spin off, which unfortunately I know of, but I haven't had time to watch. On top of that, notice when I said earlier about anime having multi genres. Well, here's another that actually has mechs in it, and I'll get to that explanation in a bit. This. Now, Magic Knight Rayearth is one of those that again has mechs in it, despite being a fantasy and magical girl type of anime. The thing is, it has those three elements. You have mechs that also represents the fantasy genre of it. And for those of you guys who are familiar with Super Robot Wars, have likely played the game, watched the anime, you guys obviously know where I'm getting at with this. But there are those of us from the 90s, that would be also moi, that have gone through the 90s religious scare. To put into context, when Batman came out, and then the sequel, Batman Returns, you had, of course, the stupid talk shows complaining about violence, as well as other nonsense. Well, this stuff not only carried into anime, but Japanese pop culture in general. Case in point, in the 90s, when Mighty Morphin Power Rangers came out in 1993, I remember pretty damn well the article that was put from Scholastic Highlights. But some are probably wondering, how can a 5-year-old know the stupidity and immaturity of adults? Well, here's one thing that all corporations always make the mistake of. Frankly, it's not just corporations anymore that's making this dumb mistake, but they are often the most cited. You insult the intelligence of a child and how they process things. However, let me get straight to the point. The article that I remembered from Scholastic Highlights, despite being a 5-year-old in a public school, was they were complaining about violence in Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. And yet, here's what my 5-year-old mind knew and how it processed it. These dumb adults were complaining about 5 teenagers chosen by an intergalactic being telling them about some sort of alien invasion, having to work together despite their differences while being in a high school setting and dealing with teenage stuff. And you're complaining about violence? You know what these clowns don't realize? They also had the upsurge in martial arts films, like Bruce Lee, who is the grandfather of mixed martial arts. On top of that, you also had spaghetti westerns, those use guns. But apparently, to the hypocritical liberals who masquerade as religious people, which of course they're not. They were also complaining about violence in anime, as well as girls being overexposed and sexualized and nonsense, while in the same breath putting out said films or TV shows that show nearly the exact same thing. So, who's the real liars in that case? It is not just the religious people that are wrong, but liberals in general, because they were complaining about those things like in Sailor Moon, in Ninja Scroll, in Wicked City, to name some. But on top of that, with video games, you know what is the equivalent of that comic code authority nonsense that started with the comic books? The ESRB. You had ones like Primal Rage, Killer Instinct, and then the one game that started it all, Mortal Kombat. That was enough to trigger the over religious people. Now, here's the biggest irony of all with the right. They always underestimate on a daily basis how kids process things. Now, are there ones that know their kids are smart but still try to steer them in the right direction? You bet your bottom dollar they do exist, because mine was one of them. However, that doesn't change the fact that there are hypocrites on the right. With that being said, they were also even complaining about Street Fighter as well. And you know what? The stupid thing is about these people, these companies started said games in Japan. Some of these games, like Super Nintendo, you had Legend of Zelda. Then you had PlayStation that created ones like Spyro, Crash Bandicoot, Final Fantasy VII, Tomb Raider. And yet you have idiots that kept complaining about stuff that they knew nothing about. And it hasn't changed decades later. Because, as someone once said before, whoa, deja vu. Because that's exactly what's happening now. Now, those of us in the 90s also dealt with the stupid nonsense when Pokemon came onto the scene. When that exploded, of course, you also had Digimon as well. But you had the stupid idiots on the right, as usual, complaining about the usual nonsense. And it took a pope, to tell the religious people, I don't give a damn about your beliefs. But in the case of Christians and all their branches, the pope told all of them, simmer down. You're overdoing it. You don't know what you're talking about. While I am paraphrasing what that might have been, he simply pointed out that you guys don't know what you're talking about. That is a common problem, regardless of your faith. None know what they're talking about. And yet, this still persisted decades later. So it comes as no surprise that you have people on both sides failing to read between the lines. Now, in the case of Toonami, while this definitely put anime on the map, I'll just list out the ones that most of us likely knew. But there's one in particular that most of you guys knew That is referred to as Dragon Ball. Rip Akira Toriyama for this. But there are those of us that only knew about the sequel, which is Dragon Ball Z. However, the funny thing with anime is when you have those who are fans of another subcategory. With that being said, there are ones that watched not just Dragon Ball, but you also had Tenchi Muyo, Yu Yu Hakusho. Earlier I mentioned about Sailor Moon, so that's part of that list, as well as the Big O, and another one in particular that a certain number of us actually know. Now, some of you are familiar with the beautiful boy character trope, whether it is Saint Seiya or some other type of anime that has said characters. I know they exist. Ladies, you know what I'm talking about. However, this particular title, while it does have said character trope, from what I recall, did not do so well in trying to replicate the success that Saint Seiya has. So, what is that anime, you may ask? Most of us later knew it as Samurai Troopers. The irony, however, in the title, as I thought about it again, is it's known as Ronin Warriors. Like so. Here's the irony. Here's a little language lesson. If you guys know about the film 47 Ronin, you know that by definition, Ronin stands for a samurai without a master. A major disgrace for those that are formerly samurai. But despite it being the 90s, it doesn't surprise me that you have people who were not very familiar with other cultures. And the funny thing is, the crests that were used for some of the characters, as well as some of the virtues, were based on Buddhism. However, when you adapted it for American audiences, that's when you really prove you really weren't paying attention to what was being taught. So it's no surprise that they changed a few of those because they thought that people wouldn't understand, especially kids. Well, I hate to break their bubble, but they're wrong. Some of us definitely knew a few things about it. Maybe not as advanced, but we knew it. So here we go again with insulting the intelligence of a kid. However, on the flip side, one can also make an argument that teenagers, to an extent, understood this stuff. But again, when you start insulting the intelligence of those that are younger compared to the adults that assume they know more, well, you prove you're either ignorant or you're just not paying attention, which one can argue is the exact same thing. But with that being said, there is a few particular anime titles that, depending on who you ask, either know it or don't. If I mention about the artist as Hayao Miyazaki, you likely know his work, you know the studio he created. But what if I told you that he actually worked on an anime film that, get this, was actually based off of a comic? But this one was actually in development hell. While I can no longer find the exact mini documentary regarding this film, unfortunately, decades later, Crapflix screwed it up, as I already predicted. That movie, ladies and gentlemen, is this: The Adventures of Nemo in Slumberland. Now, notice that the art itself, while outdated, or in this case, more dated, so to speak, is one that, well, the story may be simple, but the lessons are another thing, which unfortunately Gen Z does not understand. And that also explains why that when it comes to adaptations in general, when you go from one medium to another, it is not easy to do. Not to mention, you also have to deal with suspension of disbelief. That is something anime is able to do that live action never can. But with that being said, time for me to cover a particular genre that is obviously well known to most. You have the magical girl genre, and before I go any further, if you like what you see in here, do hit that like and subscribe button. It does help my channel, despite it, still building. Now, with regards to the magical girl genre, this one, I would say, definitely has some history, but for some of you guys, you likely would cite Sailor Moon. That's a little too easy. Notice a while ago I mentioned about Magic Knight Rayearth. That also falls into that category. But there's probably one that has been so watered down that it took me a while before I found out about the original. If you know about card captors, then you likely know about the origin, which is Cardcaptor Sakura. FYI, Magic Knight Rayearth, X, Cardcaptor Sakura, Tsubasa Chronicles. What do all of those have in common? All of those were made by the female artist company known as Clamp. And the thing is, with Cardcaptor Sakura, this one was so watered down that when I was watching it back in the day, I knew that the writing was off. While it was entertaining visually, they focused only on one thing: the romance between Sakura and Lee. However, that's just one facet of a multi-faceted magical girl title that one would almost argue was catered towards girls. That, unfortunately, is partially true. I say partially because one can make the same argument with Sailor Moon. But here's the thing that most people ignore: guys also watch it. And now you're probably thinking, oh, this guy's probably being sexist or racist or whatever. Yeah. Riddle me this. How is it that I don't like women when I already pointed out a few titles already? That's not enough for you guys? Well, how do you explain this? You have clowns that seem to keep complaining that I don't like girls. What do you call this? Or this? Or this? There's a reason why said arguments like that do not hold water. Furthermore, in the early 2000s, there's another anime that my best friend actually introduced me before when the internet was still young. And yet, turns out I became a fan in roughly record time. On top of that, one of the VAs, if you know about Hinata from Naruto, then you likely know some other characters this singer slash voice actress has played. But this is one that I personally enjoyed a lot. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Magical Girl Lyrical Nanoha. Now, on top of that, some are probably going, wait, how is this guy actually into this type of stuff? Well, even if I explained it, it's either you get it or you don't. It's not my fault that some people can't read. That being said, since I've now already debunked the usual nonsense that they claim that I'm not a fan and all of that, as well as the fact that some think that, I'm being either misandrist or women are being too sexualized. Well, here's my default response to that nonsense. And to further prove that these lunatics who keep complaining about the usual superficial nonsense, let me keep going. And one more thing.
Still seeing through me, are you?
I see what I've always seen. Your overinflated ego.
That happens to be a common thing with these ones who keep complaining about the usual nonsense. Which now brings me towards my next topic, what I call the curse of modernism. Now, given the fact that you have hypocritical voice actors who keep complaining about women being sexualized and whatever nonsense that they like to pull out of their butts, most can argue that fandoms, particularly ones like the My Hero Academia fans, which thank heavens I have never watched because most of them are lunatics, most know the common thread. They use profile pics from other animes that they either don't know or they keep playing Dragon Ball games while also using a Dragon Ball meme or profile pic, trying to pretend to be something that they're not. Well, again, time for me to point out the usual.
Your boos mean nothing. I've seen what makes you cheer.
In the same breath, they complain about the Fate Grand Order games, as well as the female characters there. They also complain about some of the ones that I likely just used as an example. This proves several things. Number one, they don't know these IPs. Number two, they've never read the manga of these titles. Three, they like to make up nonsense to justify their own stupid fetishes. And number four, when they look up certain YouTubers, they only look at the thumbnail, but they don't watch the actual episode. And they assume that just because they see the thumbnail, they know the whole thing. Well, quick shout out to Neon and Geeky Sparkles of Clownfish TV. These two happen to know a lot about Masters of the Universe. Now, for those of you guys who are fans of it, know exactly what I'm getting at. Because it is because of those two that number one, I learned some important context regarding this particular IP. Number two, I have watched that one reattempt from the early 2000s, and while it did introduce me to Masters of the Universe, and it was a decent take, what came after was a shit show. And Neon and Geeky Sparkles were targeted by these lunatics on social media, as well as a fake geek that originally worked on Star Trek. And we know how that turned out. At least the Trekkies know how that turns out. Excuse me. Because you had one character who nobody knew, and yet you had the main characters telling him to shut his trap. And you later find out that this wannabe was never a geek, and yet he keeps talking out of his mouth. These same clowns that kept mocking Neon and Geeky Sparkles, quick shout out to them and their channel of Clownfish TV, when they already have proof that they were fans from the get-go, and they introduced me to that documentary regarding the creation of He-Man, of She-Ra, and Masters of the Universe. Had it not been for them documenting this stuff, pointing out that they were actually fans who understood their shit, I would not have seen it. And it is because of them that I have a better appreciation for that show. You want another example? All right, let's go. Those who are Doctor Who fans, I did recently make a short regarding the current state of the modern Doctor Who. Now, most of you guys are already going to be telling me, dude, you do realize that's already dead, right? Yeah, I know it's dead. That's why I made a short mocking these modern idiots. Case in point, that stupid site of Kotaku, that particular modern retarded bitch who was complaining to Nerdrotic about Doctor Who. I actually like that particular backlash tweet where she challenged Nerdrotic about his collection, and she was complaining that, oh, he's not really a fan. Guess what? She got her ass handed to her. Because that dude has a shit load. In other words, a lot of merch. It showed his collection of Doctor Who, and not just Doctor Who, but I recall on one of his videos he has a lot of DC stuff, as well as Marvel, and again, Doctor Who. There is a reason why he refers to himself as Nerdrotic. So, for those clowns trying to debunk whatever it is we're talking about, save your breath. You're not doing yourself any favors. Plus, as some of the stuff that I pointed out, if you assume that I'm not actually a fan of certain things, including X-Men, riddle me this, riddle me that. What do you call this? I have been out and about around in the 90s, and I have seen this stuff. If you like the sloppy seconds and the self-inserts and the modern writing clueless bullshit, fine. Good for you. But you know what? Majority of these writers do not know shit. Majority of these wannabe artists do not know shit. You know why? Because I can tell what a pawn is. As someone once said,
In chess, the pawns go first.
they will always be useful idiot consumers. That much is clear. You are an infection, and you always will be. Now, there are those of us that are definitely responding, of course, with our wallets. And people are getting sick and tired of this modern nonsense, myself included. I already laid out a few examples. You want another? Look at the BS of what is going on with Stellar Blade. Of course, quick shout out to Grums, who is a former developer from Blizzard, for pointing this out. On top of that, I'm also giving a quick shout out to Master of TTS and Writing Raven of Gothic Therapy. They too are also covering that particular topic. It's not just them. There are others who I follow that point out the stupidity of these modernists who like to talk out of their ass, as they often do. And to reiterate a certain point again,
Your boos mean nothing. I've seen what makes you cheer.
these same clowns are the exact same ones complaining about the stuff that was going on with Near Automata. They were complaining again about 2B. They complain about sexualization of women. And you know what? These same losers were cheering when the whole Baldur's Gate 3 shit started. And you still think that I don't like women? Do you really need me to point out again the stupidity of your nonsense? You know what? Screw it. I might as well point out your stupidity again. You think that's a bit much? That's nothing. What about this? Nothing sexual about it. Or this. The only ones complaining about it are you losers who, at the same time, keep thinking about the usual nonsense that are falsely accusing not just myself, but others who have seen shit that you never have. You guys never had a life. We have. We've been there. We've done that. With that modern rant out of the way, time for me to get towards a rarely covered topic, and that is Toku anime. While I will give credit to Marco Satsu on this, the category is one that I happen to understand pretty damn well. The reason being is that while the titles I'm about to bring up do have their origins in tokusatsu, which by definition is a TV show or film that uses special effects, there is references to tokusatsu shows. You want an example? If you guys know about Dragon Ball, the fans know about this, you likely know I'm about to reference a particular character that actually wore a hat and it had a particular curve, like this shape, like my hand. Those of you guys who know that hat likely know that the one working on the character was a fan of Ultraman. You want another example? Neon Genesis Evangelion. And that's not even counting the fact that they use a particular reference that has been used in tokusatsu before. It was done with Ultraman. It was done with Super Sentai. The only problem is that you have the hypocritical religious people that take it out of proportion because it never occurred to them, as it always does, that it is actually in reference to Ultraman itself. Now, here's an obvious example. If you know about Superhuman Samurai Cyber Squad, then you know about this. One moment. This, ladies and gentlemen, is referred to as Gridman. That is the original title of this entry. While it is outside of the Ultraman universe, I'm going to point it out right now. That little curve I was talking about, this right here, that was actually used in Dragon Ball. You want to know what else was also a reference to Ultraman? This one, this pose, is something that really confuses those that really don't know their IPs. This. That is actually one of the attacks of Ultraman. You want to know a variation of that? Notice when I was referencing Gridman, as well as Superhuman Samurai Cyber Squad, for those of us who know it, the variation of that is this. That is basically used as the grid beam. As you've noticed, they actually did an anime as well as a sequel. With that being said, this is one of them. While you don't see it, it is actually known as SSSS Gridman. This actually not only references Superhuman Samurai Cyber Squad, but this and the sequel, Dynazenon. Both of these do reference that show. However, that is not the only tokusatsu anime that's been done. Another one from the Kamen Rider franchise, one of them in particular was during the Heisei era. FYI, for those of you guys who don't know, Showa is what started these titles that most of us actually enjoy, know, and love. Heisei was the second. Each of these eras were in reference to a previous Japanese emperor at that time. With that being said, the Heisei era was actually pretty lengthy. And it was actually the second half of the Heisei era where we actually get a manga as well as an anime. So, which one was it? Well, that depends if you're actually into mystery and buddy cops. So, in case you're wondering, the one that they did is one that happens to be a favorite of mine. This, Kamen Rider Double. On top of that, if you know about this, then you know about Futo Tante, or as it's referred to, Futo PI, which is this. Again, the exact same characters from this tokusatsu show, and the evidence is already clear. They did an anime that is based on tokusatsu. Doesn't mean that it can't be done. It's just depending on the IP in general. However, besides Kamen Rider, there is one that is often mistaken for Power Rangers. Unfortunately, you likely have heard of the argument slash typical response. If you only watch one type of show, then you really don't know anything about pop culture. The same can be said for those who only know one language. And of course, I might as well reference that joke. What do you call somebody that knows 3 or 4 languages? Multilingual. What is one that only knows 2 languages? Bilingual. What do you call a person that only knows one language? An American. While dated, it does have a point. The same can also be said for anime. There is a reason why shonen tards really do not understand Japanese anime or Japanese pop culture as they claim to. With that being said, this particular entry in tokusatsu is one that a select few know. This, ladies and gentlemen, is not only a mature anime and a mature tokusatsu, but the subjects that it tackles and covers is not for the faint of heart. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Garo, the Golden Knight. This entry was actually around during my high school years. It started in the early 2000s, and while it has a few spin offs, it is not as well known because it was mostly in Japan. On top of that, they eventually had enough funds to do an anime spin off. Now, if you've seen the first one, that was actually taking place roughly in medieval Spain. The second one, while not as successful, took place in feudal Japan. The final one actually harkens back to, it harkens back to the modern day setting, which is what Garo was in the first place. Now, I will say this. If you're actually into a darker setting and monsters, as well as a bit of horror, then I recommend taking a look into this entry. As a fan myself, obviously, as is shown with that picture, despite it being pre-owned, I actually enjoy it. Now, that's not to say that all different anime titles that I've mentioned so far are actually for kids. That happens to be a common stupid excuse that people who don't know about Japanese pop culture use as a shield, stating that, oh, just because it's anime, it's actually for kids. Notice some of the stuff that I've shown is more for teens and adults. Cardcaptor Sakura is one that's geared towards kids. The Precure franchise is geared towards girls. Still think that I'm not knowing what I'm talking about, despite the evidence that I just presented? Who's the one not paying attention? It sure as hell ain't me. On top of that, you still think that I don't like strong girls? Hmm? Well, how do you explain this classic, Ghost in the Shell? This one, most people point out, as usual, in addition to the film Dark City, these two titles are what inspired The Matrix. And frankly, it's no surprise to me that despite the live action take, while visually being similar to that of the anime film itself, is not, by definition, the same thing. You want context? I dare you to look up a video essay done by a YouTuber that's referred to as Beyond Ghibli. He has done one for Ghost in the Shell. On top of that, with certain anime titles, like for example, Gundam, so many iterations from the Universal Century to other universes, to each their own. Are some of them better than others? Yes. Does it depend on who you're talking to? Absolutely. Are you actually going to satisfy each person's interests? Not really. However, I will say this: Americans these days are incapable of creating stuff. You want proof? It's not just Japan that's kicking American butt in terms of creating stuff. In South Korea, they actually did respect a particular classic anime while putting their own spin on it. For those of you who know about a film called The Wolf Brigade, or as it's referred to as Jinro, know that this anime is not for kids. And it tackles themes and topics that most kids nowadays wouldn't fully grasp. And yet, despite it being done in South Korea, they actually respect the source material, unlike Americans. On top of that, to get into the topic of live action versus animation, I will say this: One Piece is a fluke. Yeah, I'm saying it right now. It's a fluke. Because despite the person that actually worked on it giving Netflix, or as I should call it, crap flicks, because it's full of crap, putting them on a damn tight leash, they actually tried to make it as close as they can to the source material. However, adhering to the source material is one thing, but some things do not translate well into others. You think it's just Americans that screw up? Unfortunately, Japan has also had its fair share. Case in point, Attack on Titan. That one didn't do as well, but there are others. Notice I covered about Toku anime as an example. That, at times, can be successful. Now, earlier in this episode, I mentioned about Voltus 5. You want a good, by the book example of respecting the source material and respecting the people who worked on it? Those Filipinos got it, hands down. And kudos to them and the team. because they love it so much that not only is it a passion project, but I can also argue that it is also a tribute project for the ones that worked on it. It is people like that know what they're talking about, that have experience, unlike the ones today. So, with that being said, this was just me giving my general overview in terms of anime that I've known as well as ones that I enjoy. Now, for some of those titles that I mentioned, if there's ones that you want to talk about, do let me know. I'm willing to try and discuss about it. However, if you think that by listening to this that you assume I don't know what I'm talking about, I dare you. I triple dog dare you. Try to find some examples of whatever I might have taken out of context and then post it. I dare you to try and post it because one, I can tell you that you don't know what you're talking about. You've never read these IPs, you've never watched it, you've never consumed it, and all you're doing is making yourself look like a fool. To that end, I'm going to repeat what I did before. And to reiterate,
Still seeing through me, are you?
I see what I've always seen. Your overinflated ego.
so with that being said, there are those of us, again, who know what we're talking about. And for those who are actually going for the physical copies of Stellar Blade, I salute you. Because when people say that the customer is mostly right, not always, notice wording there. The fact that customers are mostly right and not only vote with their wallets, they know what they want, unlike these companies who are insulting the intelligence of the customers. And not just the companies, but also artists, actors, voice actors, what have you. If you think by alienating the fan base that you're going to turn a profit, hate to break it to you, but we have plenty of evidence that says otherwise. To close out, yeah, but your corporate writers and artists and developers were so preoccupied with whether or not they could that they never stopped to think if they should. Yeah, I'm going to reference that particular classic film because when you apply it to modern day, you have people who have no life experience. But with that being said, if you guys like and enjoyed what you've read and seen and heard so far, do hit that like and subscribe button for more. With that being said, this has been Skyhound, also known as Geek Archivist Xavier Pierce. Stay safe, stay sane, and as my friend Orange Hat would say, stay humble. Peace.